town booming with wealth and excitement practically disappear in a matter of a few months? How can a town with a population of 20,000 be eradicated entirely? How can this cultural capital of the oil region grow extinct so quickly? How can a town with so much promise vanish almost as fast as it was built? This is the story of the rise and fall of one of Pennsylvania's most famous oil ghost towns. This is Pithole, the vanished city. On a hillside in northwestern Pennsylvania lies a field that was once a scene of excitement. The promise of wealth and prosperity bustled through its streets. This field was once Pithole City, perhaps one of the most intriguing phenomena of the oil boom. The territory is surrounded by a rushing stream, Pithole Creek, which flows southward and empties into the Allegheny River. Pithole was named because of the upheaval of large rocks, which left deep pits near the mouth of the creek, leading to the name of the tributary and the name of the city. Approximately 8 miles northwest lies the town of Titusville, where in the late 1850s, Seneca Oil Company sent Colonel Edwin L. Drake to start drilling on a piece of leased land just south of Titusville near what is now Oil Creek State Park. On August 27, 1859, the well started flowing and became the first commercially successful oil well. Thus began the oil rush. And many other towns were sprung up with this flush of wealth. One of those towns, Oil City, lies about 9 miles south of Pithole and has grown even larger than Titusville today. Of course, not all oil towns were lucky enough to survive when the wells dried up. Before the city of Pithole was established, there were 4 farms surrounding Pithole Creek. These farms would become the site of several derricks and one of the largest oil production sites in the region. On both sides of the creek, there was the 180-acre farm Thomas Holmden Farm. To the west was the Walter Holmden Farm, to the north, the Copeland Farm, and to the south, the Rooker Farm. Once oil production in the area got underway, these farms would sell for ridiculously high prices. At one point, Prather and Duncan sold the Holmden Farm for $2 million. There was one farm owner who wouldn't sell his farm even though there were successful wells all around his farm, because he thought his farm was the richest in the world. But eventually, James Rooker sold his farm to J.W. Bonta, James A. Bates, and others for $280,000, which was a very hefty price, seeing how the buyers couldn't be certain there would be oil on the property they bought. In early 1864, Ian Fraser and James Faulkner, residents of a nearby town called Plummer, organized the United States Petroleum Company. They leased 65 acres of the Holmden Farm. The company began to drill, not knowing if they would actually strike oil or not. Before the United States Petroleum Company finished their well, Thomas G. Duncan and C. Prather bought the Holmden Farm for $25,000, then put it on the market. Once the well was actually pumping a significant amount of oil, they took it off the market and kept it as their own. This was the first well built near Pithole Creek, and it was named the Fraser. Once people heard of the success of the Fraser well, other companies were interested in buying land in that area too, so they could drill for oil and get rich. The next well to be built in the area was the Homestead Well. It was located on the Heiner Farm and was owned by a Boston company. At first, the well pumped only 50 barrels, but the well accidentally caught on fire, and once the fire was extinguished, it increased production 250 barrels. Once the news got out about how successful the wells in the area were, everyone wanted to either have a well of their own to get rich on, or they wanted to have a share or investment in the companies that owned the well. Investments were normally made by buying 16th interests, or even smaller interests in some cases. 24th interests and 32nd interests were bought as well. People who bought 16th interests in the Twins, Fraser, or Homestead wells paid upwards of $1,000. The Working Men's Pithole Creek Association was created to buy 16th interests on several different wells. They thought the more they distributed their money among different wells, the better their chances were for making money on the stocks. One of those early investors, John Wilkes Booth. Leaving behind his job as an actor, he and his business partner Thomas Mears decided to develop oil wells in northwestern Pennsylvania following the boom. The duo called their enterprise Dramatic Oil, but later changed it to Fuller Farm Oil. They invested in a 31.5-acre site along the Allegheny River in Franklin, Pennsylvania in late 1863 for drilling, also holding investments in other nearby wells, including a 13% interest in the Heiner well at Pithole for $13,000, approximately $200,000 in 2016. Booth lived in this Franklin boarding house on the corner of Buffalo and 13th during his business venture, now the site of the Franklin Elks Club. By early 1864, they had a 1,900-foot deep oil well named Wilhelmina, yielding 25 barrels of crude oil daily, then considered a good yield, despite the fact that the wells at Pithole would grow to produce 240 times that amount the following year. The two of them, however, were so anxious to increase production that they turned to explosives to blast the well, which ended disastrously and ended their production in Franklin. Frustrated at his unexpectedly sluggish cash flow in the oil business and the South's inevitable defeat in the Civil War, he sold his shares, returned to his acting job, and began his conspiracy to kill President Abraham Lincoln just 5 months later. According to a story, on the night of Lincoln's assassination, a passerby held a lighted cigar too close to the mouth of the oil pipe at Pithole, setting it aflame. After being extinguished, the well increased its flow to 250 barrels a day. Whether the tale is true or not, had Booth stayed in Franklin, he would have soon struck it rich in Pithole, perhaps having drastic effects on history. Due to the success of the Fraser and Homestead wells, hundreds of people rushed to Pithole Creek, demanding land and hoping to strike it rich with oil. The United States Oil Company bought more property and leased half-acre lots to interested oil seekers. The lots sold at exorbitant prices, $6,000 per acre. As oil production increased in the Fraser and Homestead wells, the lot sold for twice the price. By the end of June 1864, leases near Fraser and Homestead were selling for $5,000 to $10,000 because there was such confidence in the land. In the middle of June 1864, the United States Petroleum Company built 2 more wells. The wells were named the Twin Wells because they were close to each other and started flowing around the same time. The first well started flowing at 200 barrels, then increased to 800 barrels. The second well started flowing at 300, then increased to 400 barrels. Combined, the Twin Wells brought in at least $2,000 daily for the United States Petroleum Company. Since so many wells were being built in the area, and because there really was an amazingly high content of oil underground, by the end of June 1864, the wells surrounding Pithole Creek were producing over 2,000 barrels daily, which was a third of the oil produced in the entire oil region. Additionally, new wells were being drilled daily. One of the new wells was the Island Well, which began flowing at a fairly high rate, 900 barrels. At the same time, Twin Number 2 increased its production to 1,100 barrels, so the total production of the oil in Pithole Creek continued to stay at a record high level and continued to draw people to the area. In August, the 2 most successful wells started flowing. The first was the Grant Well, that began flowing at 200 barrels, but by the next day its production was 1,200 barrels, and became known as the Prince of Wells. In the spring, the lot next to the Grant Well had been bought for just $1,600. This was before the huge oil boom occurred, and there was only a few wells in the area. But because of the success of the Grant Well, it sold for $16,500. This was the highest price paid for any half-acre lease. The largest producing well in Pithole was the Pool Well. It was located a short distance from the Fraser and originally flowed at 300 barrels, then increased to 1,500. The Morey and Rooker farms became popular places for drilling in August. There was a 24th interest on the land selling for $25,000, and now was selling for $30,000 to $40,000. There was still more to come of the amazing derricks and wells. August was not the height of the oil production. That would come later. During the busy summer of 1864, Duncan and Prather laid out a town near all the wells called Pithole. It consisted of 500 lots on Holmdon Street, which ran northwest for half a mile. Then they laid off streets perpendicular to Holmdon, starting with First Street. The 500 lots were leased for 3 to 5 years by Duncan and Prather, and at the end of that time the owners would buy the buildings on the lot, or they could be removed by the lessees. The lessees had to leave the lots without compensation when the lease expired. With the lease system in place, the whole town would be reverted to Duncan and Prather in 5 years, since they were the owners of all the lots. Although the leasing system was uncommon and should have raised some important questions for buyers, the lots sold rather quickly for expensive prices. Once the leases were bought, the buildings in Pithole were put together in record time. When the town was just developing in late May, there was only one building under construction, but in less than 1 week, all the Holmdon Street lots were filled. Most of the buildings were put up in such haste and were built with green wood, which caused a lot of them to promptly fall down. The buildings were mostly all cheap 1 or 2 story buildings because they wouldn't be able to stay in them once the lease was up, so it was useless to build an elegant, expensive building to live in for only a few years. In some cases, young men would chop down trees in the morning and be sleeping in finished buildings by night. A magazine referred to the city once as a gigantic city of shreds and patches. As Pithole continued to fill with people over the summer, more and more businesses were flocking to the town to provide comfort and luxury to the new citizens. In July, a United States post office was opened and handled over 5,000 letters a day. Due to the influx of mail, the postmaster and clerk were on duty from 7 a.m. to 2 a.m., and because the line was so long to send and receive mail, young boys would sell their spots to impatient men for $1 or more. At the time, the only post offices in Pennsylvania that handled more mail than Pithole were Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Another significant development in Pithole was that of its 2 churches. One of the first religious services was held at an unfinished hotel by a Presbyterian and a Methodist pastor, who were later donated land plots and money by Duncan and Prather to build 2 500-seat churches in August. Entertainment was certainly not lacking in Pithole. W. H. Murphy erected a theater on First Street with a seating capacity of 1,100 people, twice the size of the current-day Barrow Civic Theater in Franklin. Murphy's theater was the largest building in Pithole and was furnished with chandeliers from Tiffany's. The theater was well known for its professional Shakespeare plays. The Metropolitan Theater on Holmes Street was more low-key, with ugliest man contests, clog dancing, wrestling and boxing matches, and female contortionists. Pithole was also the home to a few clubs, including the Swordsman Club, a social club that's motto was rum, cards, and tobacco. They did, however, host the finest concerts and balls in the city, to which all the most influential people in oildom were invited. By September 1865, Pithole was home to 2 banks, 2 telegraph offices, 50 hotels and boarding houses, a railroad system, a daily newspaper, a water system, a fire company, 2 churches, tons of brothels, grocery stores, machine shops, a bakery, doctor's offices, drug stores, clothing stores, saloons, restaurants, and plenty of other miscellaneous businesses. Pithole was not all butterflies and rainbows. Ben Hogan, for instance, aka the wickedest man in the world, established himself as a thief during his childhood in New York City. In his early 20s, he moved to Pithole City and began working as a bouncer at Heenan's Cottage. The famous thief was also seen in Oil City, hanging out at the bars. He was famous for bare-knuckle fighting, and his first of many cash prize rewards in the oil region was in Pithole against Jack Holliday in April 1866. He won $200 in the fight against Jack. Ben Hogan was the type of guy that would do anything, no matter how unlawful or dangerous it was, if he got paid. He never held a job for very long periods of time, and he could be seen working in various bars in the area as a bouncer or card dealer. He first met the mysterious prostitute, French Kate, in Madame Fenton's dance house in Pithole. The two were soon business partners, and French Kate was his mistress. Ben Hogan and French Kate established dance houses and brothels in the area near Pithole, including Tiddy Youth. While many men were gathering in the oil region to strike it rich, John Mather was trying to capture it through a camera lens. Originally coming to take portraits of well owners, he soon realized an important event was taking place in U.S. history and started to preserve it with his camera. Mather was a citizen of Pithole, but had a photo gallery in Titusville and a floating darkroom on a boat in Oil Creek. Taking some of the most important photos in oil history, including this one of Edwin Drake in front of his well, Mather had perhaps the most important role in recording the phenomenon of the oil boom. In 1865, a man by the name of Samuel Van Sickle realized that transporting oil by teamster wagons was not very efficient, so he came up with the idea for the first oil pipeline. After forming the Oil Transportation Association, a 2-inch iron line linking the Fraser Well to the Miller Farm Oil Creek Railroad Station was installed along Holmdon Run. The pipeline was 5 miles long, with 15-foot welded joints, and was powered by 3 10-horsepower Reed and Cogswell steam pumps. It processed 80 barrels of oil per hour, which is equivalent to 300 teamster wagons working for 10 hours. Teamsters began to feel their jobs were in danger and tried to disable the pipeline on a couple of occasions, but were caught by pipeline security. Ida Tarbell once noted, in her famous History of the Standard Oil Company, "The day that the Van Sickle pipeline began to run oil, a revolution began in the business. After the Drake well, it is the most important event in the history of the oil regions." In September 1864, the oil production in Pithole reached an all-time high. The number of barrels produced daily was 6,000 barrels. This was 2/3 of the total oil production in the oil region. The Holmdon Farm alone had 96 wells and produced 4,000 barrels a day. Towards the end of 1864, the city of Pithole was at its peak. The population had reached 20,000 in just one summer. Just a few months before this, the city of Pithole had simply been a field in the wilderness. Now the hundreds of wells brought in 6,000 barrels daily, 2/3 the oil in the region. No one was expecting the downfall of big business. No one was expecting the town to disappear. Pithole may sound like a great, cultured city, but there was an ugly, not-so-luxurious side of Pithole too. Fires occurred often, destroying dozens of buildings and wells. In the fall of 1864, disorder slowly increased. Street fights became more common, drunkenness more prevalent, and at least one robbery a day was committed. Prostitution was also common at the brothels in Pithole. Additionally, the buildings were shoddy because they were built with cheap materials, and without plaster or lath, they were frigid in the winters. Some of the buildings were built in just 5 days, so the quality was horrendous. Another problem was the muddy roads, caused by the horses and wagons transporting oil to the Allegheny River, Titusville, Schaefer Farm, Miller Farm, and Oil City. Oftentimes, horses would be left knee-deep in the mud to die because they couldn't get them out. Towards the end of 1864 and the beginning of 1865, oil production had decreased significantly. In November of 1864, the Fraser and Island wells had dried up, creating a lack of confidence in the land. As the year 1864 drew to a close, several other wells stopped producing, and by January 1865, the daily production had dropped to 3,600 barrels a day. By December of 1866, the daily production had dropped to 1,800 barrels, and by 1867, there was less than 1,000 barrels being produced daily. It seemed the busy and exciting oil boom days of Pithole were over. As oil production significantly decreased around Pithole, so did the population. By January 1866, the eager investors, operators, speculators, and businessmen quickly left because their careers concerning the oil business were over. The population had dropped from 20,000 to just a few hundred over the span of 4 years. Some of the buildings had burnt down by a series of fires, and the best of those left standing were moved to neighboring towns. The Methodist Church was the last building standing, and even it was moved to Tynesta. The cheap buildings that were still left were sold for kindling, the derricks cleared away, and soon the farms were reverted back to their original state. In less than a few years, a bustling metropolis had become a deserted ghost town. One would think when a town is abandoned so quickly, there would be remains left to learn from and explore. So what's left of Pithole today? Pretty much nothing. At least nothing from when the city was still alive. At Drapewell Museum in Titusville, there's a diorama of First Street and a collection of artifacts from an archaeological dig off the site, including silverware, a door lock, oyster shells, and the Bonta House register book. John Wilkes Booth's cane is also on display, as well as John Mather's camera and violin. The State Pithole Visitor Center overlooks the town and has some artifacts inside and a tiny scale model of the town in its glory days. But the town it overlooks is just a field, a few young trees, some rusty equipment, and a series of plaques explaining what once was the most exciting occurrence in the Pennsylvania oil boom. Pithole City was a symbol of wealth and excitement in its heyday, a rise and fall of a cultural mecca, a true Wild West town in the oil region of Pennsylvania. As oil production significantly tell me, just tell me.
What are you doing? That's nothing. Yeah, right. Heard that story. We're making a documentary for school. Alright. I better be in that documentary. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't know this was here. So cool. Ooh, I want to go up there. I don't Hey, you're good. That's pretty good. Come on, Rachel.